I would also like to thank the organizing committee and the program committee for this event. Of course, for having me. It's a great pleasure. I'm very glad that I'm here. Now, in order to restrict myself in the time limits, I'm going to read the paper with this awfully Greek accent. And in order to redeem myself, I prepared a rich presentation where I provide some textual evidence that I'm not going to read for time's sake, but we can come back on this in the discussion. And since I realized that there is an overlapping between my presentation and Yonis and Dubian's, and I will be a bit weak on some points. Okay. And I just realized that the title is very confusing and completely useless for whatever I would like to say, so I will proceed immediately to the presentation. Lakatos' philosophical account of scientific change is characterized by the demarcationist defense of scientific rationality and the historicist premise that sophisticated philosophy of science should be history-informed. The key notion for both features is that of rational reconstruction, which entails the well-known internal-external distinction in the history of science. In his famous, even if not original, paraphrase of Kant's dictum, Lakatos stated that philosophy of science without history of science is empty, history of science without philosophy of science is blind. The passage indicates a relation of mutual dependence. Philosophy of science depends on the history of science because the latter can be the ground of a quasi-empirical process of assessing rival philosophical theories of scientific rationality. On the other hand, history of science depends on philosophy of science because the latter supplies the former with general conceptions about scientific rationality. All histories of science are inevitably methodology-laden. The double use of the term rational reconstruction, along with a characteristically uncharitable interpretation of the Lakatosian view, led to the repudiation of it. The critics agreed that the rational reconstruction offered a mere caricature of the actual history of science, and therefore the notion could not be taken seriously. In the present paper, I argue that contrary to the critics, the Lakatosian rational reconstruction is far from aiming at rigging the historical record and at turning the history of science into philosophy fabricating examples. On the contrary, it can be a fruitful notion which creates an intermediate logical space between eliminative or scientific naturalism and aprioristic philosophy, with regard to the philosophical comprehension of scientific change. This intermediate logical space consists in a moderate or liberal naturalist perspective which avoids the relativism entailed by the eliminative version of naturalism and the monolithic conception of scientific rationality stemming from aprioristic or Euclidean, according to the Lakatosian terminology, methodologies. In particular, my argumentation will be developed in 3 steps. First, I claim that the main reason for rejecting the uncharitable interpretation of the Lakatosian perspective is that forging the historical record would ruin the role of rational reconstruction as an arbiter for the assessment of rival methodologies. Second, I distinguish between the notion of rational reconstruction, which should be part of a philosophical method for appraising different philosophical theories of scientific rationality, and the notion of normative explanation, which should be taken as a historiographical category. Given this conceptual distinction, I argue Lakatos' view is sustainable and useful against the contemporary eliminativist trends in historiography of science. Finally, I argue that Lakatos' adoption of the Popperian third word, along with the Lakatosian way of evaluating rival methodologies, leads his view into incoherence. However, I suggest that the incoherence can be overcome by adapting a framework of liberal naturalism and by substituting Lakatos' inter-methodology testing with an inter-methodology testing procedure. Okay. Lakatos' demarcationist perspective comes with a meta-criterion, i.e. criterion for evaluating different demarcation criteria proposed by different philosophical accounts. Broadly speaking, methodologies which are capable of presenting a larger set of historical episodes as rational should be evaluated as better in comparison to methodologies which leave too many episodes to the external history. The testing process takes the form of successive case studies, which in general consist in the following procedure. Quote, 1. One gives a rational reconstruction. 2. One tries to compare this rational reconstruction with actual history and to criticize both one's rational reconstruction for lack of historicity and the actual history for lack of rationality. Unquote. This view, combined with the suggested dependence of historiography by the normative methodologies and accompanied by Lakatos' few verbal exaggeration, gave rise to the well-known accusation that his conception of history is a parody rather than actual history. Briefly put, the argument can be reconstructed as follows. The Lakatosian assessment process entails the comparison between the rational reconstruction according to a normative methodology and the actual history. However, given Lakatos' convictions about the methodology lateness of the history of science, the actual history is nothing more than a fabricated narrative in light of a given methodology. Therefore, the comparison can never lead to a revision of the methodology in question. The assessment process is rigged because it's circular. Moreover, this way of practicing history of science violates the internal criteria of the historian's craft. This is a Kuhnian accusation. I claim that this is a quite uncharitable interpretation for 3 reasons. I will be quite quick here. First of all, he said, I made a joke. Okay, get over it. It was a joke. Second of all, Lakatos' main concern was not historiographical, but philosophical. It should be clear that Lakatos' main concern was not historiographical, but philosophical. Rational reconstruction are first and foremost a philosophical tool for assessing different philosophical theories of scientific rationality, or, which is the same in this context, different demarcation criteria. If this is the case, suggesting that the historical data should be false seems insanely inconsistent. In the light of this obvious inconsistency, we should conclude that a minimally charitable interpretation of the Lakatosian conception of history would never take it as aiming to forge the historical record. Third, and in support of the above-mentioned conclusion, Lakatos did provide a revision of his own methodology in light of the historical record concerning the Copernican revolution. The details of the revision are not important for my argumentation here. Neither is whether or not the revision was successful. What is important is Lakatos' choice to revise his methodology in light of well-known and, of course, unfabricated historical data. Setting aside the uncharitable predisposition of his critics, we can focus on the actual problems of Lakatos' account, which also contributed to the distorted interpretation of his view. I suggest that a fundamental problem is Lakatos' conflation of the historiographical level and the philosophical level of appraising different theories of scientific rationality. As we saw, Lakatos clearly stated that his arguments were primarily addressed to the philosopher of science. However, in the very next sentence, he added, but the same argument also implied that the historian of science must in turn pay serious attention to the philosophy of science and decide upon which methodology he will base his internal history. This addition seems to imply that the rational reconstructions involved in the appraisal of different methodologies are also part of the actual historiography of science. That rational reconstruction, aside from being an indispensable part of the assessment method for the philosophical account of scientific rationality, is also a historiographical category. I think that this implication is both mistaken and partly responsible for the uncharitable charge of circularity. I also think that the source of the conflation is Lakatos' discomfort with scientific naturalism. The idea of a quasi-empirical process of assessing rival normative methodologies on the ground of actual scientific practice in the past is unambiguously naturalistic. Gioni argued for this thesis too. For it makes empirical investigation, and in particular historical study, part of the procedure of determining what science essentially is. The naturalistic attitude is contradistinguished by Lakatos with the aprioristic or Euclidean epistemologies. The main problem with the aprioristic epistemologies is that they are irrefutable. However, at the same time, Lakatos was reacting to expression of full-blown or scientific naturalism, which stripped philosophy of science of its normative content. Scientific naturalism in epistemology, philosophy of science, and science studies in general was triggered both by the so-called historical term in philosophy of science and Quine's work. A paradigmatic case of expression of scientific naturalism in science studies is the strong program in the sociology of scientific knowledge. Despite the internal difference of this philosophical camp, the constitutive principle of epistemological scientific naturalism is echoed in Roland Geary's words. Philosophers should be in the business of constructing a theoretical account of how science works. Philosophical claims about science would then have the status of empirical theories. In short, the philosophy of science should be naturalized. Lakatos is clearly opposed to this view, for he thinks that it necessarily ends up to relativism. Employing exclusively the conceptual tools of the empirical science or external history, Lakatos terms, in order to make scientific development intelligible, makes science look no better than religion or ideology. Empirical investigation can inform us about the belief modification of the scientific community, but it cannot inform us whether this belief modification is justified or not. There is no distinction between being taken to be justified by a community and being actually justified. But the lack of distinguishability is exactly the relativist crux. In other terms, scientific naturalism is eliminative with regard to the normative content, and therefore, within its context, there can be no genuine normative evaluation between different systems of beliefs. Lakatos understands that rejecting scientific naturalism in philosophy of science also entails rejecting scientific naturalism in historiography of science. If science per se is an enterprise that obeys normative standards, then past science should be made intelligible by employing normative analysis and not exclusively empirical investigation. Lakatos labels the expression of scientific naturalism in historiography of science as historiographical positivism, and he rejected on the ground of what I would call an argument from identification. The historians cannot identify what science is and what is not, let alone make historical sense of it, without a set of normative standards of scientific rationality at hand. Based on the argument from identification, Lakatos concludes that all histories of science are inevitable, methodology-laden, and that one cannot avoid rational reconstruction. It is precisely in this conclusion that there is a conflation between the philosophical and the historiographical level. Lakatos suggests that both assessment of rival philosophical theories of scientific rationality and historiography make use of rational reconstruction. The following passage is indicative of the conflation. I maintain that all historians of science who hold that the progress of science is progress in objective knowledge use willy-nilly some rational reconstruction. If this is the case, the threat of circularity emerges. As we saw, the proposed procedure for writing a historical case study includes two main steps. One gives a rational reconstruction. Two, one tries to compare this rational reconstruction with actual history. But if actual history cannot avoid rational reconstruction, then how can this comparison be fruitful? The million-dollar question. Okay. I claim that the threat can be avoided by providing a distinction between the notion of rational reconstruction and the notion of normative explanation. A normative explanation can make an epistemic fact and therefore a historical episode about science intelligible by showing how this episode conforms to a norm or a set of norms. Normative explanations are contrasted to empirical scientific explanations, that is, explanations which follow the explanatory patterns of the empirical science, for instance, psychology, sociology, etc. Normative explanations are, by definition, based on some type of epistemic norm, and hence they are mediated by our general philosophical views of scientific rationality. Epistemic norms are fallible ways of grasping truth. If an epistemic norm is valid and its application is correct, then usually this application leads to the apprehension of truth. Given an episode of belief modification, B1 to be true, the explanation for the transition from B1 to B2 can be either empirical scientific or normative. The empirical scientific explanation would give an account of the transition based on the causal order provided by one or more empirical sciences. In this case, we are blind with regard to whether or not the transition is actually justified, i.e. rational. The only information we can get by a set of empirical scientific explanations is about what the scientific community in this particular episode considered as justified, i.e. what was taken as rational. Normative explanation, on the contrary, would give us an account based on one or more epistemic norms. For instance, B2 was corroborated by new observations, or B2 was more compatible with the other theories of the field than B1. Normative explanation reveals the relation between the scientist as rational subject and the part of the world which is their scientific object in a normative way. Hence, they provide at the same time a justification of this relation. It follows that they can sustain the distinction between being taken to be justified by the community and being actually justified. The domain of normative explanation is essential in order to grasp epistemic facts as genuinely normative and therefore allow the possibility of normative evaluation of different systems of past beliefs. Rational reconstructions serve for the purposes of assessment between rival demarcation criteria, and they are, so to speak, monolithic, as Lakatos suggests. This means that rational reconstructions depend exclusively on the methodology that they are intended to test. Normative explanation, on the other hand, is a historiographical category that serves for making the actual history of science intelligible, and it does not have to be monolithic. The historians are not necessarily committed to a single theory of scientific rationality, as Lakatos seems to suggest. They are only committed to the goal of describing what was actually the case with regard to past scientific episodes. The results of the historian's work is not a rational reconstruction. Historians may use both empirical scientific and normative explanations. The latter can be based on epistemic norms which may be implied by more than one philosophical theory of scientific rationality. They will do whatever the internal criteria of their craft command in order to describe the actual historical course of science. Their goal is essentially different from the philosopher who seeks to evaluate rival theories of scientific rationality and show their cognitive means. Historians' work does not require the monolithicity that a rational reconstruction requires. On the contrary, pluralism of the kind as employed by normative explanation may be presupposed in order to make some episodes intelligible. If this pluralism is incoherent in light of a given methodology, then the problem is on the side of methodology. The methodology needs revision. This is what makes the result of historian work actual history, and for that reason it can be problematically compared with a rational reconstruction. Apart from monolithicity, another specific difference between rational reconstruction and normative explanation can be found in the self-conscious character of the application of normative standards by the actual scientists. According to Lakatos, the philosophers who defend the possibility of demarcating science from other cognitive activities reconstruct universal criteria which great scientists have applied sub- or semi-consciously in appraising particular theories or research programs. This means that rational reconstructions can ignore what the individual scientists of a particular episode think about what they were actually doing. A normative methodology can be corroborated by an episode if the belief modification in this episode coincides with the normative standards proposed by the methodology, regardless if the actual scientists self-consciously applied the standards in question or not. Normative explanation, on the contrary, cannot be applied in the absence of self-conscious application of the corresponding norms by the actual scientists. If they are to explain how the belief modification actually took place, there must be evidence that actual scientists self-consciously applied the epistemic norms which correspond to the normative explanation employed. In order to make this distinction more clear, let me use Aristotle's help. In Nicomachean Ethics, he argues that the expression of rationality is not found in actions that are performed solely in accordance with good reason, κατά τον ορθό λόγο, but in actions that are performed out of a regard for right reason, μετά του ορθού λόγου. Aristotle's theory of practical reason is not the point here, only the logical distinction. I claim that rational reconstruction requires only an accordance with good reason, with the normative standards of the methodology at hand, while normative explanation requires the existence of belief modification out of a regard for right reason. The regard for right reason is the self-conscious application of one or more epistemic norms. Having established the distinction between rational reconstruction and normative explanation, we can re-examine and revise Lakatos' account. His unwillingness to adapt a version of scientific or eliminative naturalism made him overreact with respect to historiographic practice. In order to avoid historiographical positivism, he ended up conflating the historical and the philosophical level and the historiographical level and the philosophical level of assessment between rival demarcation criteria, implying that in both levels, rational reconstructions are indispensable. However, this reaction is unnecessary. The distinction between monolithic rational reconstruction and pluralistic normative explanation can provide the suitable conceptual space within which the Lakatosian desideratum of avoiding eliminative naturalism does not come with the threat of secularity and the accusation of violating the internal criteria of the historiographical craft. The historiographical implication of Lakatos' philosophical perspective should be minimal. His account entails just the premise of the ineliminability of normative explanation. The ineliminability of normative explanation as a historiographical category does not entail that historical work provides rational reconstruction. Okay, I don't have too much time, so I will talk very briefly about the second problem of Lakatos' oscillation between apriorism and naturalism. The second problem is the adoption of the notion of third world, which is a Popperian loan, theoretical loan, and which have an immediate implication. A theory may even be of supreme scientific value, even if no one understands it, let alone believes it. Thus, the cognitive value of a theory has nothing to do with its psychological influence on people's minds. But then why we should bother? Right? There are several problems with this idea. First, one must answer how those different words interact, and also, if they do interact, why they are different words. Second, if a theory may be of any scientific value, if no one understands or believes it, then it seems completely unnecessary to appeal to the actual history of science in order to sophisticate the philosophical account of scientific rationality. And the third problem is the dilemma of case studies. Okay, Dubian talked about this yesterday in detail. I think that the problem can be avoided if we reject Lakatos' testing process, which is Lakatos' procedure stipulates that every philosophical theory of scientific rationality should turn into a historiographical program which provides rational reconstruction of the history of science. And the rival historiographical programs are evaluated according to Lakatos' own methodology. This is an expression of full-blown naturalism of Lakatos. He seems, while he wants to avoid full-blown naturalism and uses the notion of the third world and all this stuff, on the other hand, he used the same criteria for evaluating the empirical theories, the empirical scientific theories, and the philosophical theories of rationality. This is a continuum between philosophy and science. And I argue that the Lakatosian notion of rational reconstruction can be revised in a way that avoids incoherence. And the revision presupposes the abolition of the three worlds view for the standards of scientific rationality. We can replace it with a liberal naturalist view, which entails that embracing ontological naturalism does not entails does not entail methodological naturalism and the continuity between philosophy and empirical science, and B, the replacement of the inter-methodology quasi-empirical process of assessment with an inter-methodology conception of the evaluation process. Each methodology confronts the historical data and becomes, in this process, more and more refined. It's not the case that we should abandon one theory of rationality, abandon all the other theories of rationality, and we keep one, and we will consider the other as refuted. The idea is that each philosophical theory of scientific rationality can be more and more refined by confronting the historical record. And if we do that, the trouble can be overcome if we choose to comprehend the assessment process as an inter-methodology process. We should take confrontation between philosophical theories with historical data as an inter-methodology process. And if we do that, I think that commenting and interpreting the Lakatosian view could be a very fruitful work and a very fruitful contribution to the contemporary debates on the relation between the history and philosophy of science. Thank you, and I'm sorry for the time.